KJ Cerankowski is an assistant professor of Comparative American Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Oberlin College. KJ co-edited the book Asexualities, Feminist and Queer Perspectives, which came out in 2014 from Routledge, and has published articles in the journals Feminist Studies and Women's Studies Quarterly. So KJ is going to talk to us about chasing Charley and finding myself, being and becoming in the archive. In Sierra Stories, True Tales of Tahoe by Mark McLaughlin, buried in the middle of the book is a story of a reputable and heroic stagecoach driver who went by the name of Charley Parkhurst, or also known as One-Eyed Charley. The 1880 obituary for Charley, published in the Sacramento Daily Bee, consistently referred to Charley as he, even while noting upon his death he was found to be, quote, unmistakably a well-developed woman. In this talk, KJ will discuss their search for Charley, not as a recovery of a lost biography, but as the springboard for their own meditations on gender, transition, and creating an archive of the body while searching for the body in the archive. So please join me in welcoming KJ Cerankowski.
First and foremost, let me say that I'm not a historian or a biographer. So I'm not really going to give a biographical history of Charley Parkhurst. I'll tell you a little bit about Charley's life, some of the highlights, but mostly I'm going to talk about my own fixation on Charley's story and what I make of the process of chasing Charley as a way of thinking about narrative, trans-becoming, and the affective work of the archive. So for the past couple years, I've been actively looking for and calling on ghosts. I've been interested in how ghosts, especially the ghosts of trauma, haunt and impress upon the living body, and how our narratives, our tellings and retellings can heal or suffer or reshape the body in pain, the body abused and traumatized, the body remade, the body cut, the body in transition. In Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon asks us to engage a methodology of calling up and living with ghosts, to conjure what appears to otherwise be absent, to imagine what it would mean to really reckon with ghosts as a way of knowing, making knowledge, being, and becoming. She writes, the whole essence, if you can use that word, of a ghost is that it has a real presence and demands its due, your attention. In Spectres of Marx, Derrida asks, what does it mean to follow a ghost? And what if this came down to being followed by it, always, persecuted perhaps by the very chase we are leading? Gordon suggests following the ghost is about making a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located. It is putting life back in where only a vague memory or a bare trace was visible to those who bothered to look. It is sometimes about writing ghost stories, stories that not only repair representational mistakes, but also strive to understand the conditions under which a memory was produced in the first place. Toward a counter-memory, she writes, for the future. As I enter the archive, I think of it as a space into which I follow ghosts, and perhaps am followed by them. The archive is a collection of memories, of documents waiting to be curated and collated into a story, a ghost story, perhaps. How do we put life back into the materials of the often dead? Where do we look for the traces, the memories not only of a life lived, but a life currently being lived, the hands that hold and have held the documents, that have sorted them, the eyes that have seen them, the hearts that have raced or slowed with each discovery of an image or a turn of a page? Jamie A. Lee, who in fact visited the transgender archives here at UVic for her own project on archive methodologies and the affective and material resonances of queer archives, imagines archives as affective bodies that communicate across generations, across the past, the present, and the future. Lee suggests the archival body exists in the liminal and porous space and time between past and future. I have spent the past couple days in this liminal space, flipping through the pages of Renaissance News, the letters and photos of Reed Erickson, the pages of the FTM International newsletter, the Constitution and surveys of the Self-Help Association for Transsexuals, I have been searching for ghosts, for answers to I don't know what, to myself, to something in the past, something ever present, or something yet to come. Derrida begins his seminal work on hauntology with an epigraph from Shakespeare's Hamlet. The time is out of joint. For Derrida, haunting is where we find time out of joint. Haunting is historical, of a past, but it is not dated or not specifically located. It is the time of ghosts, the time between life and death, the time after life, the time after death, the time before life, a time of liminality, between past and future, maybe. The time of learning to live can happen only between life and death. The time of the learning to live, Derrida writes, is to learn to live with ghosts. And here I have spent the past couple afternoons learning, still again, to live with ghosts. This is what I imagine it is to be and become in the archive, to brush up against the memories of ghosts, our own and those of others. In so doing, I become preoccupied with my own affective and somatic responses to the materials I encounter. Jamie A. Lee writes, touching, smelling, and stroking what remains of distinct material lives might elucidate arousal and certain peaked, unnamed, and unknown affective and haptic responses within the visitor to the archives. I cannot help but think of Anne Svetkovich's Archive of Feelings, a way of imagining the production of affect through the everyday effects of trauma that become archived in our bodies, how we hold the stories of others along with our own stories in our flesh, the muscle and tissue, the aches and pains, the desires and longings, in the being and becoming what we were, are, or will be. Svetkovich notes how traumatic events refract outward to produce all kinds of affective responses and not just clinical symptoms. I ask how this constellation of knowing and feeling makes me who I am, become who I am, or exist as I always was. In Tender Points, Amy Berkowitz notes how so much of the advice doled out to the traumatized is to look forward, not backward. Focus on what you need to do to get better, not what caused your illness. Berkowitz cannot look forward. She needs to know the tangled chain of events that got her here. Looking back, she writes, is what I need to do to get better. In the archive, I am looking back in order to find myself here. Though I entered the archive with the explicit goal of viewing a newsletter write-up on Charley Parkhurst, which I will talk more about shortly, I also came with a spirit of discovery. I came ready to explore which objects called to me or pulled me in or directed me elsewhere. As Jamie A. Lee cites from Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, we are not only directed towards objects, but those objects also take us in a certain direction. And this is how I came to look through the files of Reed Erickson, out of sheer curiosity, conjured perhaps by some ghost. And so I find myself flipping through a collection of family photos in an undated envelope simply labeled Erickson and Family. I become fixated on a series of photos of Reed Erickson wearing nothing but a pair of black briefs and a gold chain around his neck. In some, he is standing, looking at something outside the view of the camera lens. In others, he is doing something, bent over looking at an object, standing with his arms on the shoulders of another person. In one, the one I come back to again and again, he is flexing, mouth open, looking down and off frame. There are so many questions I have. Why is he hanging out in his briefs? Who is taking these photos? Why is he rarely actually looking at the camera and the person taking the photo? How old is he? Where were these taken? I don't know. I cannot piece together the story behind these photos, but they haunt me. Looking at Reed here, I become overwhelmed with some sense of sadness or loss. He began his transition in 1963, around the age of 46. In these photos, he appears to be much older than that, perhaps already well into his drug use. I feel mournful admiration, perplexity, kinship. My heart skips a beat. As I continue to flip through the photos, I come across a few that have been chopped up and are glued back together. One clipping is a close-up of his chest. I stare at his chest, the arc of his pectorals, his nipples. Who cut this close up and what for? What am I searching for in these photos of Reed? Do I see my own chest in his? Do I lament that his chest seems to look better than mine, despite the fact that I had my surgery almost 50 years later, which should allow for plenty of technological advancement and perfection of surgical technique? Who is this man? Who am I? Who is the man I am becoming? That was supposed to be a joke about surgery. I think back to Jamie A. Lee's account of her student discovering a photo of a man filleting another man in the Queer Archive in Arizona. Lee writes, "The eyes want to look again. The body responds and curiosity is piqued. What moves a body into such distinctly opposing responses that pulls the eyes to look again, yet shame, such a desirous gaze away from this second and third glance? The archive aphrodisiac tugs erotically at the body. The body remembers. The body holds its knowing of those times past and moves quickly through its own inventory, taking such non-conscious memories. I have to face my own erotic attachments. And I don't mean the erotic here in a sexual sense, or not necessarily, but following Audre Lorde as a site of empowerment, or following bell hooks as a practice and pedagogy of love, as something sensual, embodied, and full of desire, non-libidinal even. I look and look away. I look away and look again. The eyes want, the body wants. The gaze is full of shame, desire, envy. What does my body hold of knowing Reed Erickson? Of knowing Reed's body as I know my own? How does my body reach into the archival body, blend together, conjure ghosts to make knowledge, to feel knowledge? Jean Vaccaro writes, "The labor of making transgender identity is handmade, collective, made with and across bodies, objects, and forces of power. A process, unfinished yet enough. Process, not progress. Autonomous choreography. Free. Do it yourself. Non-geometrical transformation. Free form. The handmade is a haptic, affective theorization of the transgender body. A mode of animating material experience in a cumulative felt matter. The labor of making the transgender body in the archive is collective, across time, haptic. I am touching the materiality of the memory of a body, handmade as I handmake my own body, living in the time between, in the time of ghosts." If the transgender body is shuttling between the organic and the mechanic, the toxic and the domestic, the surgical and the cosmetic, in what Jack Halberstam describes as its postmodern technotopic space, it is also shuttling between nonlinear temporalities of will be's, were's, might have beens, and yet to comes. So, how and why did I begin chasing the ghost of Charley Parkhurst? The how I can tell you. The why I am not so sure about yet. So several years ago, on my first trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains around Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border, I picked up the book Sierra Stories, True Tales of Tahoe by Mark McLaughlin because, as a true nerd, I often like to read histories or stories set in the places I visit while I am visiting them. Reading that book by lantern light in my tent on the north shore of Lake Tahoe, I found buried in the middle of the book the story of the stagecoach driver, Charley Parkhurst, or One-Eyed Charley, born in 1812 in Lebanon, New Hampshire, who made his way out west to drive the whip during the gold rush and died of tongue cancer in 1879 at his home in Watsonville, California. As McLaughlin tells the story of Parkhurst, quote, "She became the first woman to vote in the United States, 52 years before the passing of the 19th Amendment. In fact, the Pajaro Valley Historical Association erected a plaque on Charley's grave in Watsonville, stating that he was, quote, the first woman to vote in the U.S., but they otherwise carefully avoid using any pronouns for Charley. The 1880 obituary for Charley, published in the Sacramento Daily Bee and republished in McLaughlin's Sierra Stories, consistently refers to Charley as he, even while noting upon his death he was found to be, quote, unmistakably a well-developed woman. Upon reading this story, I became fascinated not only with the story of Charley's life, but also how the stories about Charley are told, how Charley becomes both he and she in different imaginaries. And I don't think I ever finished reading the rest of the Sierra Stories book. I can't remember any more of it. I just reread over and over again the story of Charley Parkhurst in that book. And so there are all sorts of stories about Charley as a legendary whip, smoking cigars while handling the reins of 6 horses, accomplishing the skilled and difficult feat of passing 2 wagon wheels over a gold coin tossed in the road just ahead of the coach, killing dead with 1 shot an infamous stage robber known as Sugarfoot, whom Charley exacted his revenge on after being robbed once by Sugarfoot, driving his team and passengers to safety over the raging Tuolumne River seconds before the bridge collapsed, holding onto the reins while being dragged along a mountainside by a spooked team of horses, and of course becoming one-eyed Charley and donning an eye patch after having an eye kicked out while tending to a horse with a nail in its foot. There are different stories about Charley's origins, but most trace his birth to New Hampshire, to life in an orphanage that he ran away from, and later came to work on farms and in horse stables along the east coast of the U.S., before heading out west in the 1850s to make money driving prospectors in Wells Fargo's riches in the California gold rush. After reading that first story about Charley, I read everything I could get my hands on that had anything to do with him, including 2 poorly written historical novels, all the websites and wikis I could find, old digitized news clippings in the Digital Transgender Archive, and it was in this digital archive that I saw that the Transgender Archives here at UVic hold the physical copy of an issue of Renaissance News. Looks like this. It's a little dark. And it's a newsletter published by the Renaissance Education Association, which currently describes itself as a nonprofit, non-political, educational and social support organization founded and designed to educate and support persons regarding transgender issues, sexual orientation, sexual identity, or gender identity without prejudice. So remembering Jamie A. Lee, as a body, the archives have distinct physicality. To understand such a material and physical thingness of the archives require also engaging considerations of bodily experience in and out of the archives as part of knowledge production. I knew I needed to hold that newsletter in my hands and turn the pages of paper as I read this story of Charley. I wondered if it would bring me closer to Charley's ghost. And so I'll note that when I found it in the digital archive, when I saw that there was a physical holding here, I didn't read it online. I waited to get here to read it. And so inside the newsletter on this page, you can see in this, it's hard to read here, but it says trivia here, and then this is where the story of Charley begins. And I will just read that for you. And I think that it was written by this person, Brenda Davidson, whose name is at the top of this whole section here. So it says, impress your friends with this bit of suffrage knowledge. The first woman to vote in a presidential election was a transvestite known as Charley Parkhurst. Now that I've got your attention, Charley was born in 1812, and while still a child, ran away from an orphanage to involuntarily pursue a career in stable cleaning. When the gold rush of 1851 began, Charley thumbed it to California, where his natural talent with horses netted a career change to stagecoach driver. Charley quickly gained homage as the Mario Andretti of the trade and was described as being a lush, tobacco-chewing foul mouth with a quick temper. Charley piloted his last wild ride in 1879, and when the undertaker was comparing Charley's body, it was found that Charley's body parts didn't match Charley's body. I don't really know what that means. And then there's in parentheses, hey, this is a broad. Charlene had voted in every election from 1868 till his demise in 1879, and no, I didn't make this up or get it from Rocky and Bullwinkle. The archive produces affect. Let me not forget to mention how angry I felt while reading this. Angry at the sheer inaccuracies, calling Charley Charlene, whereas Charley is actually Charlotte. Charley as a lush who was rather known for his sober driving. And also I was simply given pause to consider narrative. In these issues of Renaissance News, the focus, these early issues anyway, this is from 1992, The focus was really on transvestites. In fact, I read through one issue defining the difference between transvestites, homosexuals, and transsexuals. So this writer named Charley a transvestite, a part of that community. I cannot know if Charley was a transvestite, a cross-dresser, a trans man, a woman, transsexual, transgender, any of the categories we might choose to describe someone like Charley today. These terms are not so easily exported across historical location. I don't even know how I want to tell Charley's story, but here I am telling it, conjuring the ghost story as I go. But I remain intrigued by how different people or groups spin the stories of Charley Parkhurst, and to what end. How it is that no matter the context, Charley is always some sort of hero, whether the first suffragist or the baddest whip in the land, or a pioneer cross-dresser or trans person. Who is Charley to me? I'm still piecing this together. Before coming here to the archives, I took a trip to the Pioneer Cemetery in Watsonville, California, to visit Charley's grave. And here's the image of Charley's grave. So this is where Charley is buried, and then the memorial stone was actually erected in 1955 by the Pajaro Valley Historical Association. And the memorial reads, Charley Darky Parkhurst, 1812 to 1879. And I'll just note, too, that Charley's named Darky there. Some people believe that Charley was actually named Durkee, D-U-R-K-E-E. So there's a little bit of uncertainty in the historical record about Charley's full name, but here it's listed as Charley Darky Parkhurst. Noted whip of the gold rush days, drove stage over Mount Madonna and early days of Valley. Last run, San Juan to Santa Cruz, death in cabin near the 7 Mile House. Revealed one-eyed Charley a woman, the first woman to vote in the U.S., November 3rd, 1868, erected 1955, Pajaro Valley Historical Association. As I approached the site, I noticed papers scattered about the immediate area, some of them still stacked next to the grave marker. I collected the wayward pages and bundled them together and weighted them down with a rock to help prevent the wind carrying them about the graveyard again. And then here's a photo of me gathering the papers and reading through them. I then flipped through the pages, which were notes from what appear to be local school children that they brought to Charley's grave around the end of May of this year. I sat there and read through each letter, all addressed to Charlotte. It seems as though the students had read about Charlotte being the first woman to vote in a book called Riding Freedom, which I actually hadn't yet heard of, so I learned something from these school children. It turns out to be a children's novel written by Pam Munoz Ryan, and the novel is about Charlotte, quote, a smart and determined girl who figured out how to live the way she wanted. So here's just a sample of what the children had to say to Charlotte. Dear Charlotte, I really enjoyed reading about your life. I was surprised when you escaped from the orphanage. You were brave. You were the first woman to vote. Also, you never gave up and kept trying. I felt bad when you got kicked in the face. Oh. Dear Charlotte, I really enjoyed reading about your life. I was amazed because you are the first out of all women to vote. You are the bravest person I have ever read about. My favorite part of the book is that you got kicked in the face, and you acted like nothing happened to you. You are the person I admire to every day. I want you to be the same way that you were before and now in heaven. We love you, Charlotte. Sincerely, Diana. And then this was just an envelope that said, you are the best. To Charlotte, you were a brave girl, from Ari. Dear Charlotte, I really enjoyed reading about your life. I was surprised you were sneaky because you escaped from the orphanage. You were the first girl I've ever read about who pretended to be a boy. You were the first woman to vote. My favorite part of the book is when you were determined to vote. I really enjoyed the book about you. Sincerely, Nico. And from my understanding in this children's novel, the story is that Charlotte actually ends up in an orphanage for boys, and so actually passes as a boy since childhood. And then in other historical accounts, Charlotte's in an orphanage for both boys and girls, and only sort of dresses as a boy after she runs away from the orphanage. There's another account where an older boy at the orphanage that she becomes really close with tries to dress her as a boy so they don't have to be gender segregated. There's different stories about when Charlotte started dressing as a boy. But what I found interesting was that Nico's letter here is the only one of the whole bunch that acknowledges that Charlotte pretended to be a boy, or ever dressed as a boy or as a man. And so in finding these, it's sort of I was thinking about how the school children have kind of left their own narrative archive at Charley's gravesite for me to sort of think about and ponder as I sort of imagine the different ways to talk about Charley's life. And there's also this drawing from the first slide. That was one of the children's drawings there. So back in the archive, I returned to read Erickson's papers. I'm drawn in for hours reading every intricate bit of marginalia in his collection of clippings from the National Enquirer. Of course, I imagine that he read the National Enquirer religiously because it was the only journalistic outlet at the time to publish trans stories, sensational though they may be. But this is just the ghost story I tell. I have not verified that speculation. I'm not really a historian. In Erickson's papers, an article from the National Enquirer dated January 31st, 1978, catches my eye. The headline, "Britain's top army doctor who fought duels and flirted with ladies was a woman in disguise." This article is about James Barry, born in 1799, birth name unknown, died in 1865, thus overlapping Charley's life for several years, but across the pond in England. I was immediately struck by the differences between the two, James being a flirt and ladies' man, Charley celibate and ignoring the ladies' advances. But I was also struck by the similarities in narrative, James Barry's valor and the discovery of his womanhood post-mortem. Some of my favorite narrative moments from the Enquirer. Dr. James Barry rose to the rank of Senior Inspector General in the British Army, fought duels, flirted with the ladies and belonged to men's clubs, yet incredibly was discovered to be a woman after she died in 1865. All England was flabbergasted, and the army was mortified by the stunning masquerade, which Barry had managed to pull off successfully for about 60 years, ever since she was 10 years old. An official report described the little doctor in high-heeled boots as the most skillful of physicians, but also the most wayward of men. It was at Cape Town that the youthful officer became known as a lady killer. According to author Kenneth Young, she began to be a man. She enjoyed a racy story, liked a glass of wine, hunted and shot with gentlemen, and danced and flirted with young females. But Dr. Barry, who sometimes carried an umbrella and frequently had a little poodle trailing behind her, was also devoted to duty. Returning to London, she fell fatally ill, refused medical attention, and asked to be buried without examination. But her wish was never granted, and after her death on July 25th, 1865, Dr. Barry's lifelong secret was finally revealed. In flipping through some of the old FTM newsletters, I also came across a few mentions of Jack B. Garland, especially highlighting Lou Sullivan's book on his life. The newsletter states Garland was an FTM in San Francisco from 1869 to 1936, having lived the last 40 years of life passing as a man in a time when no hormones or surgeries were available. I don't know yet what I'm doing with these bits and pieces of story, of ghost stories. I've only just started collecting them after a while of a couple of years of sort of chasing Charley's ghosts. I'm curious about what they stir in me affectively, somatically. I don't know how I will tell the stories or which stories are mine to tell. I'm simply following the objects, the ghosts, and letting them direct and redirect me as I piece together a body that is holding and can hold the memories of ghosts. So.